The black SUV climbs the winding mountain pass. The air changes. The humid heat of the delta vanishes, replaced by a biting chill. Fog rolls over the windshield like white smoke. Inside, James is driving. He drives slowly with one hand. His left arm, the injured one, is in a sling, resting against his chest. Diep sleeps in the passenger seat, wrapped in a thick wool coat Vance left behind. Her breathing is soft, creating small puffs of mist in the cold air. James looks at the GPS, a blinking red dot in the middle of nowhere. "We're here," James whispers to himself. He turns off the main road onto a gravel path hidden by pine trees. The car crunches over pine needles. Ahead, a small wooden cabin appears out of the fog. It looks abandoned but sturdy. Smoke does not rise from the chimney yet. James stops the car. Silence. Only the wind whispering through the pines. He touches Diep's shoulder gently. "Diep, wake up. We made it." Diep stirs. She opens her eyes, looking at the misty forest. "Where are we?" she asks sleepily. "The Cloud Kingdom," James smiles tiredly. "Vance said no one looks for people here. It's too quiet." Inside the cabin, it is freezing. Dust covers the furniture. A cold draft seeps through the floorboards. James shivers. He is still wearing his thin shirt from the escape. "Stay in the coat," James orders Diep. "I'll start a fire." He walks to the stone fireplace. There are logs stacked nearby. James kneels. He reaches for a heavy log with his good right hand. He tries to lift it. It's heavy. He instinctively tries to use his left arm to support it. Sharp pain. James gasps, dropping the log. It bangs loudly on the floor. He clutches his injured shoulder, face twisting in agony. Diep rushes over. "James, stop!" "I can do it." James grits his teeth, sweating despite the cold. "I just need momentum." "Sit down," Diep says firmly. She pushes him onto the dusty sofa. She walks to the woodpile. She picks up the kindling, small twigs and dry leaves. She arranges them in the fireplace. She strikes a match. The fire catches. Small flames lick the dry wood. Soon a warm orange glow spreads through the room. Diep turns to James. She takes his cold, trembling hand and rubs it between hers. "You held the roof for 4 hours," she whispers. "Let me hold the firewood." James looks at the fire, then at his wife. The billionaire who controlled empires is now dependent on the woman he vowed to protect. "I feel useless," he admits, voice low. "You are resting," Diep corrects him. "Even kings need to sleep." Night falls. The cabin is warm now. They found some supplies in the pantry: canned soup, tea, and a bag of flour. James sits on a chair near the fire. He catches his reflection in the window. He looks wild. Stubble covers his jaw. His hair is messy. "I look like a bear." James touches his chin. Diep laughs. She finds a small travel kit in the bathroom: a razor, a bowl, and a bar of soap. "Sit still," Diep says, pulling a chair in front of him. She whips up some lather using the soap. She applies the white foam to his face. Her fingers are gentle. James closes his eyes. He feels the warmth of her hands. Diep picks up the razor. It glinted in the firelight. "Do you trust me?" she teases, positioning the blade at his throat. James smiles, keeping his eyes closed. "With my life and my face." Scritch, scritch. The sound of the razor cutting through stubble is rhythmic and soothing. Diep works carefully. She tilts his head back. She wipes the foam away with a towel. She traces the line of his jaw. There, the handsome CEO is back. James opens his eyes. He catches her hand and kisses her palm. "Not a CEO," he says softly. "Just a husband." Diep blushes. "The soup is ready. I made something." It is a simple flour dumpling soup. No meat, just broth and dough. They eat from a shared bowl sitting on the rug by the fire. It tastes plain but hot. "When I get my money back," James says, blowing on a spoon of soup for her. I will buy this forest, and I will build you a real house here. I like this house, Diep says, looking around the dusty cabin. It has no servants, no Sophia, just us. James nods. He realizes he likes it too. Later that night, the wind howls outside, but inside is a sanctuary. James is lying on the rug, his head in Diep's lap. She is humming a lullaby, a folk song from her village. James listens to the melody. His eyelids grow heavy. The pain in his shoulder dulls into a throb. Diep, he whispers. The baby kicked me yesterday. Diep smiles, stroking his hair. He kicks a lot. He is restless, like his father. Does he have a name? James asks. We never talked about names. Diep stops humming. She looks at the fire. I thought about Ben, she says. It means peace, because we have been running for so long. Ben, James tests the name. James Ben? Or Benvoir? Whatever you want, Diep says. Peace is good, James agrees. But I want him to be strong too, to hold roofs. No holding roofs, Diep shakes her head. Just holding pens, or paintbrushes. Suddenly, Diep gasps. James sits up instantly. What? Is it the baby? No, Diep whispers, pointing to the window. Look. James turns. Through the foggy glass in the moonlight, a shadow moves. James reaches for the fireplace poker. His instinct to fight returns instantly. Stay here, he commands. He moves to the window, peering out into the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes stares back. James holds his breath. Is it Sophia's spy? A bounty hunter? The shadow moves closer. It steps into the light. It's a deer, a small brown deer looking for food in the snow. James lets out a long breath. He lowers the poker. It's Bambi, James chuckles, relief washing over him. Come look. Diep creeps to the window. She sees the deer sniffing the pine needles. It's beautiful, she whispers. It's alone, James observes, just like us. The deer looks at them for a moment, ears twitching, then turns and bounds away into the mist. James turns back to Diep. The adrenaline fades, leaving him exhausted but happy. False alarm, he says. We are still invisible. He wraps his good arm around her waist. Let's sleep, he says. Tomorrow I start building the cradle, even with one hand. Tomorrow, Diep agrees, resting her head on his chest. The fire crackles, dying down to glowing embers. In the high mountains, far from the chaos of the city and the mud of the delta, the runaway billionaire and the village girl finally close their eyes in peace. Morning breaks over the highlands. The sun is sharp and bright, piercing through the mist. James wakes up early. His left arm is stiff, throbbing with a dull ache. He carefully slips out of bed, tucking the blanket around sleeping Diep. He walks out to the porch. The air smells of pine resin and wet earth. He sees a pile of discarded wood scraps near the shed, old pine planks, rough, uneven, but usable. James remembers his promise. I will build a cradle. He drags a heavy plank to the center of the yard. He finds an old rusty saw in the shed. He oils it. He places the wood on a stump. He steps on it with his boot to hold it down. He grabs the saw with his right hand. Zet! Zezet! He starts cutting. It is difficult. Without his left hand to guide the blade or steady the wood, the saw jumps. The plank wobbles. James grunts, sweating. He tries to pin the wood down harder with his knee. Zest! Snap! The saw slips. It cuts a jagged line, ruining the plank. The wood falls off the stump. James drops the saw. He stares at his useless left arm in the sling. Anger boils up. He kicks the ruined plank. Hard. Damn it! He shouts, his voice echoing in the quiet forest. Useless! He feels like a cripple. He feels like a failure. A billionaire who can't even build a box for his child. He sits down on the stump, head in his hands, breathing heavily. A shadow falls over him. He looks up. Diep is standing there, wrapped in a shawl, holding a mug of tea. She watched everything. She doesn't say a word. She puts the tea down. She walks to the woodpile. She picks up a new plank. She places it on the stump. She kneels down on the grass. She places her hands firmly on the wood, holding it steady. She looks up at James. She nods. Cut. James looks at her small hands holding the rough wood. He looks at her eyes. No pity, just partnership. He stands up. He picks up the saw. Watch your fingers, he warns hoarsely. I trust your aim, she smiles. Steady, rhythmic. The saw bites into the pine cleanly. Sawdust flies into the sunlight like gold dust. They work in silence. James cuts, Diep holds, James planes, Diep sands. James hammers, Diep holds the nails. He is the muscle. She is the balance. Together they make one complete carpenter. Hours pass. The sun climbs high. Sweat drips from James's nose. Sawdust covers his hair and Diep's eyelashes. By noon it is finished. It is not a masterpiece. It is a simple rectangular cradle made of raw pine. The edges are sanded smooth. The legs are sturdy. James runs his hand over the wood. It feels warm. It's rustic, James critiques, trying to hide his pride. Not exactly Italian design. It's perfect, Diep runs her finger along the rim. It smells like the forest. James looks at the leftover wood scraps. He picks up a small block. One more thing, he says. He takes out a small pocket knife. He sits on the porch step. He starts whittling. Diep sits beside him, resting her head on his good shoulder. What are you making? The frog, James says, carving the wood focusedly. From your story, the one who wanted to reach the sky. He carves slowly. His hand is tired, but his heart is light. He carves a funny-looking frog with big eyes. He drills a hole in it and ties it with a piece of string to the top of the cradle. He pushes the cradle gently. The wooden frog swings back and forth. Click-clack, click-clack. For James Bin, he whispers. Diep laughs softly. Or Vo Bin. James turns to her. His face becomes serious. Diep, look at me. He takes her hand. His palm is rough, covered in sawdust and small cuts. I have no ring left, James says. I sold it for the boat. I have no watch, no black card. He gestures to the humble cabin and the handmade cradle. This is all I have. Me, this arm, and this wood. Is that a complaint? Diep asks softly. No, James shakes his head. It's a realization. In the penthouse, I had everything, but I felt empty. Here I have nothing, but I feel full. He kisses her knuckles. I promise you, James says, his voice shaking slightly. I will work. I will chop wood. I will carry rice. I will do whatever it takes. You and the baby will never go hungry. Diep touches his face, brushing away a speck of sawdust. We know, she whispers. We never doubted you. Suddenly, a sound breaks the peace. Beep, beep, beep. It's the burner phone Vance left in the car. James freezes. The bubble pops. Reality rushes back in. He walks to the car. He picks up the phone. It's a text message from Vance. Just 3 words. Bank accounts frozen. James stares at the screen. He knew it was coming, but seeing it makes it real. The last lifeline to his old world is cut. He is officially poor. He deletes the message. He puts the phone away. He looks back at the porch. Diep is rocking the empty cradle, singing softly to the wooden frog. She looks happy. James takes a deep breath. He squares his shoulders. He walks back to her. He puts a smile on his face. A real smile. Who is hungry? James asks loudly. I think the master chef can make grilled corn today. Diep looks up, beaming. With onion oil? With extra onion oil, James promises. He starts a fire in the outdoor stove. The smoke rises into the blue sky, disappearing into the vast, free mountains. They are broke. They are hunted. But for today, in this quiet corner of the world, they are kings.
Giữa đêm mưa bão, căn lều nhỏ bị xé toạc, sàn nhà gãy xuống ngay trên giường. Jem lao lên, dùng hai tay trần những thanh gỗ nặng, trở thành cột trụ sống để che chắn cho Diệp và đứa con trong bụng. Hàng giờ trôi qua, máu hòa cùng nước mưa. Cơ thể anh tê cứng nhưng vẫn cắn răng không buông. Khi Van xuất hiện, họ phải lội qua dòng nước lũ để thoát thân. Jem nhiều lần ngã quỵ vì kiệt sức. Trong căn motel rẻ tiền, Diệp ôm lấy Jem trong bồn nước ấm, thì thầm rằng anh chính là ngôi nhà của mẹ con cô. Bình minh đến, Jem vừa tỉnh lại thì hay tin đoạn video anh bốc phát ở lan truyền trên mạng lọt vào mắt Sophia. Nơi ẩn náu không còn an toàn. Không kịp hồi phục, Jem lại đứng dậy kéo Diệp và Van bước vào cuộc chạy trốn mới.